Hi, friends. My guest today is journalist Rebecca Clarren. Well, I should say journalist plus, but we'll start with that because that's how she came on my radar. Her work has appeared in Mother Jones, High Country News, The Nation, Indian Country Today. And for her journalistic work, she's won a Hillman Prize, an Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship, numerous grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. But she's much more than a journalist, as you'll find out from our conversation. Her debut novel, which we touch on, was called Kickdown. That was shortlisted for the PEN Bellwether Prize. Kind of exhausting reading all of her awards. We're not even done yet. She's also a published poet, and her work has appeared in the North American Review, Catamaran, CutBank, Poetry Northwest. We don't really touch on her poetry, so you might want to track down her work after hearing this in those publications. We spend most of our time talking about The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance, an incredible book that she wrote, in which she kind of turns her journalistic eye on her own story and her family's story. It was named a best book of 2023 by Kirkus Books, The Forward, the Christian Science Monitor, the Tribal College Journal. And this incredible book is done with such artistry and power, and many people recognize that. I did an event with her at PSU about this book. Highly awarded book. Rebecca and I talk about Jewish identity and values and the way in which those inform her work. She has a passion for amplifying marginalized or silenced voices, the kind of stories, the narratives that get buried under the normative narrative about any number of situations. And we talk about that. We talk about storytelling. We also talk powerfully about how grief and loss have informed her life and her work. Israel and Gaza comes up because we're talking a lot about contested narratives and competing voices. And really powerfully, she discusses the balance of truth and compassion and how her learning with her rabbi informed her work and balancing those two values of truth and compassion. So it's a really rich conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it. So this is my conversation with Rebecca Clarren. Rebecca Clarren, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I am excited for this conversation because, well, I loved getting to learn with you and getting to know you in Art Lab, but also because I know your work, or I should say, I first became familiar with you and your work through The Cost of Free Land. And I want to start there and I guess I want to ask, first, what led you to begin the work that turned out to be The Cost of Free Land?
Well, I had been writing a series of stories that were running in The Nation and Indian Country Today about how sort of the legacy of federal policy, its impact on Native communities today. And I had spent a couple years doing that research, and that was a layer on top of 2 decades of reporting in the American West and writing about, during that time, at times, about Native communities. And I just had this, I always say it wasn't like an aha moment, but it was this slow dawning realization that stemmed from super many conversations with Indigenous elders, sources, that made me realize, oh, wait, I'm talking about this impact of federal policy. I have failed to see this is my story too, because my ancestors were immigrants who got a free federal homestead on the South Dakota Prairie. And the feeling that came up for me around that, since you asked about feeling, is a profound feeling of fear, curiosity, and a sense of, I can't believe I didn't know this. I've sort of an embarrassment. Like, this is so shocking that this is so obvious to me now. And it wasn't so obvious for me for all this time.
And wait, what? Tell me that. I really get that. But why fear? You said fear.
Oh, I think can be scary to confront what we don't know, especially when it's family stories, because so much of this book ended up being confronting the stories I have been told about my Jewish homesteading ancestors And how do I nuance that story? How do I make it more complicated, more truthful? And a lot of fear came up for me throughout the process around, will the living members of my family feel betrayed by
Yeah.
me nuancing these stories? Will people still want me to be in the family? And on the other side, the Lakota story that I was telling, because for those of you who don't know, my ancestors received land from the feds that the feds had taken and stolen from the Lakota Nation. A feeling of what really motivated this book was a hoping to settle the scale a little bit, clarify a story that had not been told, in my opinion, enough. That was an effort toward healing and truth telling. But what if that effort toward healing, the fear was, what if this effort toward healing creates more harm? That's how, as a non-Indigenous person, telling an Indigenous history as part of my own would cause problems, would cause harm.
Oh, interesting. So you mean you had anxiety about how telling this story might upset the narrative that your own family had, but you're also saying, if I understand you, that you felt like maybe you would be doing further damage to Native folks in the Lakota who felt like, no, this is our story to tell.
Exactly.
Wow. So what was the story that your family had that you felt like you were forcing them to reevaluate?
The story that my family told over and over again, there were many stories, sort of what I refer to in the book as our greatest hits, the stories that are so they show a lot of pluck, they show a lot of character, they show a lot of toughness and commitment to Jewish life in a really hard place. But they missed the broader context. They failed to share anything bigger about where the land came from. I don't think my family's unique in that way. I have done almost 100 events at this point since my book came out. I've traveled to more than 20 states, and so many people have come up to me and said something along the lines of, my family got free land from the federal government. And until this moment, it never occurred to me where that land actually came from. Never really occurred to me whose land it had been before it was ours. And that is common because most of us, at least of my generation, I think this is starting to be changed in some places. The history we were taught in school and even in college did not help us edit those family stories to help us broaden our sense of what is the bigger picture of what's happening behind a funny little story about, oh, wasn't it great that great grandpa Harry lived in a cave, or Uncle Louis could stand on the back of a horse, these kinds, or my cousin would every morning when he was 5 years old clear a path of rattlesnakes between the claim shack and the outhouse, these kinds of stories.
So much depends on where one starts a story, right? If the beginning of your story is Uncle Louis was on a horse or whatever, or, we had this place on the frontier and it was, people had to live by their wits and yada, yada, then that's one kind of story as a storyteller. Does that inform that? Or do you think about, like, what, for example, in your novel, do you think about what does it mean to start the story in a certain place?
I love that question. No one's ever asked me that. I think because I've been a journalist for 25 years, it's been the main thing I've done as an adult. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of a story told from just one perspective. Mm-hmm. As a reporter, I was trained and taught and lived on the job, realized the best way to get a story is to talk to as many people as possible. So when I sat down to write a novel, the story is told from 3 different main narrators' perspectives.
Yeah.
You live in the minds of 3 different people. And I just felt like that was so important to me as a novelist to explore, like, this idea of what is actually truth. Because in the novel, you start to see that the different people's perspective really who's telling the story really changes the story.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, then when I'm writing this book, The Cost of Free Land, it's creative nonfiction. It's a blend of memoir and history and journalism. But again, I call it an entangled history. It's entangling the history of my family and the White Bull family, this Lakota family that I've come to know. Because again, what happens when we don't just tell the story from one person's perspective? I think that's really been important to my writing and to the way I'm trying to grapple with the idea of whatever is the truth.
I had been thinking of connections between Kickdown, which is but for folks listening, that's the name of Rebecca Clarren's novel from 2018. There are connections between Kickdown and Cost of Free Land, which is the multiplicity of narratives and how that affects our understanding of truth. Kickdown came before Cost of Free Land. The question of multiplicity of narratives and how we arrive at the truth is not just a philosophical abstract, as you well know, but it's really very much part of our lives. So I'm interested in how that idea lives in you, or how that question has lived in you in your work.
I don't know where this desperate longing to understand the truth in all its nuance and complexity comes from. My first word was, what's that? Like, I think questioning, it's very Jewish to question. It's very much my family culture to question, to grapple. And I think in some ways, I actually have been thinking about this a lot. So my aunt and uncle were murdered on Pan Am Flight 103, which was the Lockerbie, Scotland flight, when I was 13 years old. And I was very, very close to my aunt. I referred to her in my journal the day she died as my third parent. Having such a trauma happen at such a young age, I think, shaped my worldview in innumerable ways. But one thing is, we've never learned all these years later why that bomb was put on the plane. I still have no sense of why my aunt and uncle had to die. And I've been told over and over again, justice has been served, but that has never attended to any part of my grief. And I can't help but think, for many years, it just never occurred to me that had anything to do with my work. But my agent has recently told me she thinks that it is. And the more I think about it, I have to agree with her that maybe there is this sense for me. I think it's common. I just read Daniel Paul Pelsner's wonderful biography of Lin-Manuel Miranda. And he had a young, Lin-Manuel Miranda at a very young age had an experience with losing someone very close to him. And it drove him to want to make the most of his life. And I feel like my brush with Judy dying, my aunt, it's compelled me to feel like you never know what's going to happen. You better use every second of your life. And this longing, and somehow for me, the questioning, the trying to make sense of things is a part of how I have tried to make meaning of my life. I think that is part of why journalism has been a really good fit for me as a career. And I have brought a lot of journalism to novel writing, to the poetry I write, and then, of course, to the creative nonfiction, which is, of course, also journalism. But the longing to research and report and see things from multiple angles, that tends to show up no matter what I'm doing.
Wait, so the grief of that loss for you animated you, like, because like you wanted to begin to understand like why this happened and what happened, or was just a sense of like the urgency of life and wanting to?
I think it's more that. I think it's twofold. One, how do I juice the days? How do I make everything count? Because of this really clear understanding that I could die any moment. Any of us can die any moment. And so how do you make a life of meaning and make it count now? And then I think the other thing, I think that's been it. Don't wait. Don't be patient. And that's exhausting too, obviously. That's not like a recipe for a great life necessarily. That's a very exhausting way to live. But also, I think there's also in there a sense of like, my aunt died when she was 37 years old. I'm 50. She never got to have kids.
Wow.
And she really wanted to. My mom always thought she was coming to tell us she was pregnant. She was coming to visit us when she was on the plane. And so I think there's also this part of like, she and other people I know who died young, I always have this sense like, I'm so lucky. I better make it count for them because they didn't get to live. So I'm here. I'm lucky now. So I guess that's, I don't know. It's not helpful, but my parents always said, we don't care what you do with your career, but we hope it helps people. There's also this sense like I have an accountability to those who have died to do something that they would feel like was a worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah.
That made the world a little better.
So that sense of urgency and mortality, the imminence of mortality, which is a pretty heavy thing for a young person to be, brushing up against. It kind of combined with this impulse to make meaning and to honor or to manifest your parents' requests that you do something that is good for people somehow as part of it. Your work in journalism really began to focus your interest in what is the truth.
I was always trying to write stories about communities that I felt like weren't getting enough attention.
Yeah.
I love the feeling of knowing something that feels really meaningful and important and consequential that no one else knows or not enough people know. Like that's been really an exciting thing for me.
Yeah.
And so a longing to understand the truth in its complexity, a longing to figure out how to write about it in a way that people will listen. I had done tons and tons of reporting about oil and gas development in the American West. I'd gotten a big fellowship. I'd spent a whole year just doing that research. And then I realized I don't want to write a book about everything you need to know about oil and gas development. That's not a book I would want to read. That's why I ended up writing it as a novel. I tried to kind of bury that eat your vegetables piece in a narrative.
Right.
But hopefully it wasn't just about
the
impact of oil and gas. But the book Kickdown is set in it's the story of two sisters trying to hold on to their family's ranch in the midst of an oil and gas in Colorado.
Folks can still find your stories at The Nation, and that's good reading for trying to understand some of these questions that we began with about how, in the contemporary context, how native people are mistreated, and that's worthwhile reading for folks. Okay, so can we stay on this truth question for a minute? Do you think we can know the capital T truth, which is obviously different from like truth in journalism, but do you think people can know the biggest truth?
My best answer is it's a question we have to live. And by what I mean by that is you have to test it. Right. And I think there's lots of ways I have learned imperfectly and I'm still trying to figure out how to test it. So how do I know the truth? I know it by talking. I'm an extrovert. I know it by talking to many people I trust who I think are smarter than me and who are really different in their backgrounds. So for me, if I talk to lots of different people who come from lots of different places in the country and lots of different the backgrounds, and where are the places where their beliefs and understandings and things start to overlap? It's in those overlaps that I start to feel like, well, there's something there.
Yeah.
And I also think there's something about what's embodied. Paying attention. I've learned as I get older how to pay more attention to kind of like what arises in me physically as I'm thinking about something. Where do I feel like crying? Where am I feeling my body tense up? I think that is a way of attunement to what is a personal truth.
Sure.
But I also feel like I have to be honest. I've been a journalist for 25 years. I still feel like I don't know what I'm doing with my life. I still feel like I am a little bit lost in the wilderness of my own mind. Like I know once I have an assignment, when someone tells me, go do this story, I'm like excellent at just digging, talking, having questions, trusting those conversations. But there's a lot of space in between those assignments.
So to come down from the philosophical to a little more practical, and I'm asking this question, and in the back of my mind is this is the like chaos of American politics right now. You know, like some people are absolutely sure that this happened on January 6th, and other people are totally sure that there's no way that happened. As you have explored multiple narratives, competing narratives, I should say, in your many in so much of your work, man, is there a way to build bridges between those different narratives? Like, what do you do either as a journalist or maybe in the Cost of Free Land or other work where you've seen different claims about what has happened in a situation? How do you manage that as an author? And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about what do we do when we're faced with totally competing, negating claims to the truth about what really matters in our lives practically?
Well, it's where I'm very fortunate as a journalist because I get to just talk to everyone, hopefully.
Yeah.
And the way that I think there's so much good research out there about how fundamental storytelling is to our sense of the world and our sense of ourselves. And there is, in my opinion, it's maybe too simple to say just this, but a piece of what's happening in America right now is that the way some people are I'm not saying anything brand new. Lots of people talk about this, but where people are getting their news is so narrowly, we're only going funneled into certain areas. There's less of a sense of conversations. I mean, even when you look at the political map, so much blue on the edges, so much red in the middles, we don't really get a chance, just even geographically, to have conversations with each other. And I get it. I mean, some of these political conversations are devastatingly personal. And it feels like an attack on my family.
Yes.
To have the awareness that someone believes a different version of the truth than I do. Just them believing an idea feels like an attack on me because those ideas are behind policies that are being pushed that actually do have a personal impact on me and my family.
Yeah.
So this is no longer theoretical. It is absolutely, it can be life-threatening, right?
Yeah.
And a way that I have seen is for people to be in each other's communities, to find ways to be in conversation. And that is not easy to do. But, and clearly that's a thing that's been happening all over the world in pockets. And I know we still have terrible war and strife. I will say in my research, it was really interesting to me. Like I was obsessed. This is just one example, but I was a kid who was obsessed with the Holocaust. I thought by the age of 12, I was reading every book I could get my hands on. I had never, ever heard that Indigenous Americans refer to what happened to them in America as the Holocaust. And when I was or that Hitler was inspired by American treatment of Native people, like had his lawyers look in American laws to figure out how to take away rights legally from Jews in Europe. That was based on how America had taken away legal rights of natives and Black people here. But when I was spending time in Lakota communities, almost everyone referred to it as the Holocaust that happened here, their Holocaust. They knew that history about Hitler. Like, again, this is just a small example of just not cross-cultural conversations.
People have to start communicating and talking, but there's so many walls between us that one can fall into despair thinking like, how do we begin to mend? I felt in reading The Cost of Free Land, I thought one of the most beautiful and important parts of that book was kind of between the lines, so to speak. And that is that the other thing that's missing in so much political discourse, you approach questions of justice and injustice with real compassion. You certainly, first and foremost, honor the horrible legacy of murder and dispossession that is part of the Lakota story, but you're very realistic and compassionate for your own ancestors context, and you don't just come down on hard on them with some kind of simple judgment. And anyway, my larger point is I think that the ability to try to see people on their own terms is such an essential part of beginning to heal the rifts between narratives. So I just wanted to share that and see if you had any thoughts about that, because it seems like it was quite deliberate.
Oh, for sure. I have a piece of paper on my desk right behind my computer that says truth and compassion. And I wrote it down after going for a walk with my own rabbi, Benjamin Barnett, one day, where he just reminded me again, you have to tell the truth, but you've got to do it with compassion as much as you can. And I think including the historical context is a way I have found to feel compassion. Right. That is not to get us off the hook living today. Right. It is important that we hold ourselves accountable, for sure. I don't think the context in which we live excuses us from taking responsibility. But I think if we can drop our shame, that is a piece of being able to step into responsibility. So just this sort of flogging, like, oh, we were bad, that doesn't, in my experience, help me to move forward.
Right.
So part of the deep contextualizing of, for example, my ancestors weren't terrible people. They weren't making connections between themselves and Native Americans and how they were benefiting from policies that were harming their Lakota neighbors. Well, they were struggling to survive, and they were coming from a place and a country that had been brutally violent towards them. And there was a threat of brutal violence toward them because they were Jewish. So they were carrying a lot of their own fears. Part of what allowed me to be more compassionate toward them was conversations with an indigenous judge named Judge Abby Abenanti, who's Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation. And she said to me, and I write this in the book, when you're running for your life in terror, you're not stopping to have a restorative justice conversation along the way. It's going to take several generations of not living with what we call today trauma to step into responsibility for this. But that is why it is my responsibility, my cousin's responsibility, my brother's responsibility to look at this, because we are lucky that we didn't face the trauma of our ancestors growing up.
Your ancestors wouldn't have had the tools or the ability or the resources to do the kind of reflection that are a couple of generations removed, you now can, because you're not in fight or flight, or we don't feel that same level of anxiety. Yeah, that's really beautiful. I want to shift a little bit to ask to step into very fraught territory, and that is to talk about how we think and talk about Israel and competing narratives in that context. Your book came out right after these attacks, or just before, I forgot what you said, with the attacks of October 7th. And then, you're having these conversations around the country to talk about your book as the war is proceeding, as Palestinians are dying, as Israelis are in terror. And I'm just wondering, what resonances did you find between these stories about land and indigeneity?
The book, really, my book, The Cost of Free Land, is really focused around three questions. What are the stories we tell in families and in nations? What are the stories we don't tell? And why don't we tell certain stories? Peter Beinart, his book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, I think he articulates this so well, and in a way I won't be able to articulate here. But I do think he is asking, and what I think is a huge resonance between the questions of the cost of free land, the questions of how do we as Americans, the questions I'm trying to suggest we all ask ourselves as non-Indigenous people in America, is why haven't we here learned a more complicated story about our origins in this country? And what would happen if we faced that, a more complicated and nuanced truth? And I think as an American Jew growing up here, speak about myself, the story I was told about Israel and Palestine was not very complicated, wasn't very nuanced. And I think the resonance I see even within members of my own family, who fascinatingly, there was so much support ultimately for the book, The Cost of Free Land. I'm so grateful for that. I'm so honored. And yet, as all of this horror is happening in Israel and Gaza, members of my family are wildly disagreeing. This close Jewish liberal family there's not within my own, not with my parents, but broader, and people having really different perspectives and having a really hard time. And I think there's that, to me, what's at the heart of that is a sense of betrayal among some younger members of my cousins, that they didn't get a story about Israel that felt to them was enough of the truth.
Yeah.
In a sense, and feeling very reactionary of the defendedness.
Yes.
The lack of being able to extend compassion and truth telling to Palestinians that they were seeing within other members of the family. And I think, of course, that family story resonates across the country. You've heard these kinds of stories.
Absolutely.
And, I am not a Middle East expert. I'm not at all someone who can speak in a deep way about the history of Israel, the history of Palestine. But I will tell you, I've talked to experts at this point who have said, listen, it is not the same history, what happened in America and what happened in Israel. Those are very different histories. And if you start to say they're the same, if you conflate them, you get in trouble really fast.
Yeah.
And I think there have been a lot of people who have wanted to say they're the same.
Yeah.
And those people are coming from a sense of trying to grapple. They're coming, I think, from a place of heart, of trying to understand and make sense of something they're very upset about when they're seeing starving and killed human beings on the other side of the world, and feeling an American connection to that because our money is paying.
Yeah.
That said, so you can't say that it's the same history. I know you're not saying that. But of course, there are great rhymes and resonances between the two. And there are so many. One that really struck me, I had very big ears for it early on because I had spent all these years reading the history of how America and the United States talked about Native people here and using really dehumanizing language to justify the killing and murder and attempted genocide. It's the same language that was being used by the Nazis to describe the Jews. It's describing them as inhuman, as beasts, as savages.
Yeah.
And then I'm hearing in the news, that's how the IDF is describing Palestinians. It's how Hamas is describing Jews. And that resonance felt so profound.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating and upsetting. I have found, and these are my words and not Rebecca Clarren's words, that the Jewish community has been, it makes it extremely difficult to have an honest reflection about Israel and an honest self-assessment. When Rabbi Barnett told you, truth and compassion. And I think that there are people in our community, and it's true all over the world for all peoples probably, who feel like if you have compassion, the truth is going to get overshadowed, or if you have compassion, justice is going to be threatened.
That's so interesting. Vengeance is threatened. If you have compassion, vengeance is threatened.
Yeah.
Justice, for too long, in my opinion, has been equal to vengeance. Justice is not vengeance, not true justice,
right.
in my opinion.
Right.
And I think actually compassion is the key to true justice. Truth telling is the key to true justice. And I agree. It is embarrassing and upsetting to me, the failure of many people that I love who are Jews and non-Jews to hold binary thinking, that things can be complicated and both be true. But at the end of the day, what matters to me is basic human rights.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, who has water? Who has food? Who has the right to go to sleep and not worry that their children will be murdered? At
Yeah.
the end of the day, everything else is somewhat theoretical. We can debate what is compassionate and what is not. But for a long time before October 7th, Palestinians did not have basic human rights. At this moment in America, many Native Americans do not have basic human
Mhm.
rights.
Mhm.
So I think, to me, that is the question that I care about. There's a lot of theoretical thinking that I think is interesting and important to discuss. But I think what is more important is to say, do
Yeah.
we value human
Right.
life that is outside of our in-group?
Right.
Do we see the connection between not leading with compassion and how vengeance gets in the way
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
that?
So there are like facts on the ground that you're saying should make some of these questions uncomplicated. We certainly can
should.
agree that everybody should have water and food, and we have to do whatever we can to make that happen. Yeah. Yeah.
I think so.
Maybe you can just explain, or you just share your thoughts about how you see teshuva, which is the Jewish process of self-accountability, often mistranslated as repentance, and that involves some level of repair. You took that idea and you apply it kind of collectively. And I'm wondering if you can just share your thoughts about teshuva.
Well, my thoughts about teshuva really come from conversations with different rabbis and studying, in particular, with my rabbi, Rabbi Benjamin Barnett. We did have Ruja together for several years, and we looked in places in the Torah and the Talmud where there's discussion about tshuva, about atonement and repair and repentance. And layered throughout the Cost of Free Land are the teachings that really were the meatiest and the most helpful to me when thinking about my relationship to the ways I had benefited from American policy that had harmed Lakota people. So I think about tshuva as, how do we turn inward to our better nature, to the more compassionate pieces of ourselves, both for ourselves and for others. And as you, of course, know, Maimonides has this teaching about how do we do real repair. And it, in my opinion, does hold up. There's these steps, and in some ways they're so rigid and they're annoying to me in their rigidity, but they're also really beautiful because a framework and a constraint is where, in my experience, creativity comes from.
Yeah.
So having this structure, which is, first you stop doing the harm. Well, you can argue we're pretty far from stopping doing harm to Native people in this country right now. But at an individual level, I think for those of us, for example, who descend from homesteaders, what does it mean to stop doing the harm? It might be to stop telling the story the wrong way.
Uh-huh.
It might be to start educating ourselves about the way we have benefited from American policies that harmed our Native neighbors. And then there's a certain number of steps. Maybe you could make a link in the notes of the podcast to those who lay out the Maimonides steps. But to me, one of the most important steps is making it right for the way the person who has been harmed wants it to be right. So for me, that meant lots of conversations with Lakota elders, in particular Doug Whitebull, who is a Lakota elder who I write about a lot in the book. And it was through those conversations and through years of us knowing each other and me asking, how could my family offer some kind of repair? We don't own our land in South Dakota anymore. Right. It's not like we can give that land back to the Lakota Nation, which is really what is longed for and wanted. Mm-hmm. But there are Native-led efforts to, as private land comes up for sale, especially in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which for the Lakota is as important to them as Israel is for many Jews.
Wow.
It is for them where their origin stories are. It's where many rituals must be conducted. You can't do them elsewhere. Mm. And even the United States Supreme Court ruled that the United States stole the Black Hills.
Yeah.
And so as private land comes up for sale, this Indian Land Tenure Foundation, it's a Native American led nonprofit. They're buying up land quietly and holding it in trust for all Lakota people. So my family ended up creating a family foundation that is giving money to those efforts. And I set our fundraising goal at $1.1 million, which is the amount of money. I did a bunch of research and looked into the deeds and mortgages, and $1.1 million is the amount of money my family got off that free land in South Dakota that we got in mortgages. That doesn't even include the amount we sold the land for.
Yeah.
And so that's how I've made sense of tshuva in this specific.
Yeah. I love that I think what's often missing in some of these conversations around, I remember a few years ago when I first started hearing about land acknowledgements before meetings, there's something that didn't resonate with me because it was like, it just felt kind of self-serving, like, okay, we say this and then we're good. So what I love about this is the practicality. I'll put it in the show notes, but what's the link that people go to if they wanted to donate?
If you go to Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and then you go to donate, and then you can see donor advised funds.
Awesome.
And it's the Heysapa Sinicon. It's the Heysapa Land Recovery Fund.
Okay, great.
That's a lot of notes, but you'll
fabulous. I love that. That's very powerful. So much more to talk about, but this was so interesting. And I just really, really appreciate how you think through these incredibly complex questions with compassion and truth. So I'm going to end on our last two quick questions for you and then bid you farewell. And one is just tell us something you want people to know about. It can be anything you want to share with folks.
I recently got to see As You Like It at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and I thought it was so beautiful that I walked away weeping.
Wow.
I just thought it was unbelievably powerful, and it made me want to make something beautiful with other people.
Oh, wow. God.
If you live in Oregon and you can get to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival.
Yeah, that amphitheater and the desert night and Shakespeare, it's just so magnificent. Okay. And what is the best Jewish food?
Okay, not to brag, but I have to say my brisket is really good. I mean, my dad says it's the best brisket he's ever had in his life.
Oh, man.
It's a combo of my auntie's recipes with Julia Tershin's recipe. I've combined them.
Okay.
So good.
And man.
It is to me, if I ever bring you a brisket, you will know that is the best sign of love of my heart to you.
I'm literally salivating right now. Rebecca Clarren, this is so fun. It makes me want another conversation with you, but I really appreciate your generosity with your time and the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Robbie.
All right.
Great to see you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.